All right, for next Sunday we'll be in 1 Timothy chapter 4,
Yes.
and a very good content. Paul is still really concerned for Timothy about these false teachers and the fact that these people are coming in as wolves in sheep's clothing, and he's just over and over, he keeps coming back to that theme of being aware, watch out, these threats are there. And so I just reintroduced that whole idea that Paul is accusing these people of deceiving the believers when it came to the law of Moses and the grace provided by Jesus. And so he is warning Timothy to be ready. And our big idea is believers must be nourished on God's Word so they will know the truth. Now, I've included it in the notes, but I'll say it here at the beginning. All of us that have been around ministry very long have asked people to cover different religions and to share what their beliefs were, and can we delve into some of these cults and know what they teach. And my response has always been the same for years, and that is, if you know the truth, error will expose itself.
Amen.
And so really, we should be committed to knowing the truth rather than worrying about trying to know and debunk some of the religious errors that are out there. All right, so the first point that he brings back to Timothy's attention in chapter 4 is be aware, okay? I know you got the lessons last week. I'm not sure how many of you have them with you, but I asked for some more to be reprinted, and they may still show up, but Janae was picking up somebody for church tonight. One thing you need to understand is in verse 1 of chapter 4, he mentions the latter times. And we need to understand that for the New Testament authors, the period of the church age, or the age of grace, is really kind of a mystery. They don't necessarily understand that would go on for 2,000 years. From this side, we're glad that it has, because the age of grace has been extended to so many people for 2,000 years, allowing them the opportunity to come to Christ. But when he talked about the latter times, in the mind of those early believers, they were in the latter times. They were expecting, because the latter times are defined in the scriptures as from Jesus' first coming to when he will come again. And even in Thessalonians and some of the other books we've already studied, Paul is encouraging those who were seeing some of their loved ones die, and they were asking questions like, how is it that they're dying and Jesus hasn't come back yet? Because the first century believers believed he was coming back. It was the latter times. And so Paul points out that in these latter days, there will be these deceivers come. And so you need to be ready. And I often say it this way, it's the genius of Christianity that every generation of believers have believed they would be the ones that would see Jesus come back. And here we are still in that position, believing we're going to be the ones to see Jesus come again. All right, so he's talking about this group of people that are here to interpret the Bible falsely. They're false teachers, and they're propagating lies of seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. And so on the one side, he's going to talk in this chapter about the doctrines of devils, but he's also going to talk about sound doctrine. And that's what Timothy is supposed to give his attention to, all right? He also says in verse 2 that the deception is they're involved in speaking lies and hypocrisy. Now, what was happening is with these false teachers in Ephesus is similar to what was happening in the time of Jesus. You remember that Jesus confronted the religious leaders of the Jewish people. And one of the things that Jesus condemned them for was the heavy burdens that they would place on the Jewish people, and they themselves would not lift a finger to relieve those burdens. Nor would they even do what they were telling everybody else they needed to do. So Jesus did that, and Paul's kind of drawing that similar analogy with these people. And he's saying they're making requirements, they're making demands that they themselves don't believe or practice. And it came down really in a couple of areas. By the way, he mentioned there in verse 2 about their conscience being seared. And it's the idea that they have lied so much that their conscience doesn't even bother them anymore. There's no moral governor at all because they're just liars. And so Paul is heightening Timothy's awareness of that. All right, the two areas, as it turns out, that these false teachers are causing to be lies to the people turn out to be this. In the area of marriage, what was it that Paul says these liars were, how were they handling the area of marriage?
Saying you shouldn't be married.
Exactly. Now Paul had already addressed this. It came to light a little bit today as we were talking through the whole idea of husband of one wife and the criteria. But in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul was very clear that if a person was single and felt like that was the thing that God wanted them to do, then that was fine. But he also commended marriage and families and raising up godly children. And so Paul had clearly said it's all right and it's appropriate, and in most cases it's right to be married. Well, these people were saying, no, you shouldn't be married. Not if you're a true follower of Christ. Well, that's going to mean you run out of converts, and even a generation later you're going to run out of bodies if nobody's reproducing. But the truth of the matter is, that was an adulteration of the truth. That's not what was being taught. It's almost really an example of early monasticism. These people who were already, just within a century of Jesus, less than that, they're saying, you shouldn't be married at all. You should be solely devoted to Jesus and to God. Okay? And then they've reintroduced heavy burdens when it's related to food. And they had gone back to the Mosaic law of food and had even gone further in some of their prohibitions for the Jewish dietary laws. So Paul addresses that in this issue with Timothy, and he says, listen, you need to correct those errors. He said, food was created by God. It's a blessing from God that we have food. Amen. Now again, amen. Good Baptists, I expected Baptists to react more violently that way. But the truth of the matter is, in Acts 15, remember they had addressed the whole issue of food, and the only prohibition that the apostles had placed upon the Gentile converts was what? Yes, they were not to be. They were not to eat blood, and they were not to eat meat that had been offered to idols. Other than that, and that's what Paul addresses here, God has approved all food. It's okay. Except, but how are we to receive that food? With thanksgiving. We are to sanctify it with prayer and thanking God for providing for it. God's the one that created it, and He's the one that is telling us to receive it with thanksgiving. All right? Okay, the second idea, main thought then, is the idea of being disciplined. And Paul commends Timothy and says, you're a good minister of Jesus Christ. He already acknowledges that, even though he's a young man. And he said, but you need to commit to the study of these things about the gospel and give these things to the brethren. You're to be nourished up in the words of faith and good doctrine, Timothy, and pass that along to the other people. Verse 7 to 10, he contrasts sound doctrine with profane and old wives' fables. Remember, even when we were in chapter 1, he said similar things, refuse vain janglings, right? All those kinds of things. So again, Paul's addressing the fact, hey, don't listen to these myths, these old wives' fables that are being propagated. you commit these people to the teaching of sound doctrine. It's also in this passage where he says, because it was probably these young men, these false teachers that were also abusing Timothy because he was a young man.
Yeah.
Don't let them despise your youth, right? And so that's part of this whole idea of being an example as well as being disciplined. This is the passage where Paul says, hey, Timothy, listen, bodily exercise profiteth little.
Amen.
Also Baptists in the group. Of course, he's not saying there's not value to taking care of our physical body, but it's all temporary. And any of you who have ever worked to get in shape know how quickly you get out of shape when you stop doing it, right? And so he's saying, listen, bodily exercise, there's profit to it, but it also profiteth little. What is important is that you exercise godliness and that you be given to the promise of life, both here and in the life to come. Eternal stuff rather than temporary. All right, that's part of what we're dealing with in 7 to 10. Now, this statement does not mean that all people will be saved. That's right after the statement I've bolded there. Trust in the living God who is the Savior of all men. Some people pulled that portion of a verse out and tried to make a doctrine on it. The truth of what that's saying in the context is clear. Christ provided salvation for every person, potentially. But they have to receive the gift. It's not that just because he died on the cross, everybody's going to be saved automatically. That is not the clear teaching of the New Testament, is it?
His death was sufficient.
It was sufficient, but not efficient. I like that. Yeah, good. Dan, thanks. And then the final thought here is just to be an example. Beware, be disciplined, and then be an example. And so once again, he says, let no man despise your youth. And he tells his protege to be thou an example to the believers. And he encourages him just to be careful with the flock. And he deals with the issues of, in verse 13, he says, till I come. And then he says, give attention to what? Till I come, give attention to reading. To meditate. Well, exhortation specifically, and doctrine. All right? So in those three areas, he says, listen, don't deal with all the false junk out there. Don't even give them the time of day. Don't respond to them. Don't get involved in meaningless conversations with them. You just be teaching the truth. And until I come, you give attention to reading, which really probably has a context of publicly reading the scriptures. And by that time now, we're starting to see some of these New Testament books, some of these epistles. They've been written, they've been copied, they've been sent around. And so not only would it have been the Old Testament, but it would have been also some of these new writings from the apostles. Okay? And then to exhortation, which is that idea of strong encouragement. And then give attention to doctrine. And that may have been the most important part of the instructive part of the Christian worship service, was dealing with doctrine. Okay? All right, so I think this will be a fun lesson to deal with, and I'm sure you'll do well. See you next week.